I'm calling the special committee meeting of the whole, and we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I guess we're still doing elbows. Okay, roll call, Ms. LeBreau.
Ms. Blanks?
Present.
Ms. Cantor?
Here.
Mr. Davidoff?
Here.
Ms. Fay?
Here.
Mr. Gold?
Here.
Ms. Kerrigan?
Here.
Mr. Sweeney?
Here.
Mr. Winograd?
Here.
And Mr. Williams?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. LeBreau. Appreciate that. And we will go right on to business items. Mr. Hart, over to you. This is the review of the amended FY 2022 budget and capital improvement program.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council. Did prepare a PowerPoint presentation for this evening that I'd like to run you through, and it will cover both of these business items. Both are included in this presentation. It's similar to the slides that I had sent out to you and posted in board docs with some differences that I'll explain along the way. For those council members who are on the phone and those members of the public who might be watching, this PowerPoint presentation is available on board docs now. So in putting this together, and I know we've taken a little bit of a hiatus on the budget over the last month or so, and the council did that intentionally at our recommendation, and that is because the governor allowed municipalities across the state to extend their local budget process through June 30th in order to give us some time to review and understand the potential uses of the American Rescue Plan funding. And those rules and regulations, as you know, were just recently published on May 11th. And we are still working through those, but we do have a better understanding of them. So Mr. Privatera, our Chief Financial Officer, and I prepared these proposed amendments in consultation with the Mayor for your consideration tonight. So let me work through it, and I only have a handful of slides here. Then we can pause for questions and discussion. So first of all, talking about, let me just get rid of this little thing if I can. I'm not going to bother with that. Talking about the current fiscal year. So the current fiscal year, we are recommending that the council allocate some of the rescue plan monies for two different purposes. One is to help balance the current year budget, and recall that for the current year, the council had included $1.5 million in fund balance. We are proposing that instead we use rescue plan monies to cover that. That way we would not need to draw down fund balance, and we could keep it at the 9% level. And we're proposing $1,350,000 for that purpose. And then another $170,000 that we could utilize to reimburse ourselves for unemployment costs that were due to the result of the pandemic. Council will recall roughly a year ago, we laid off approximately 130 part-time employees across the organization. We have been able to bring many of them back, but we did incur unemployment compensation costs for the current year. So that would be for fiscal year 21. We would utilize some of the rescue plan monies for that purpose. Moving on to the next slide, and I have a number of slides that speak to this, but just as an overview. So what we are recommending here is a series of adjustments to my proposed budget. In aggregate, they would total a little under $55,000. And we would reduce the proposed budget accordingly and take in some additional rescue plan monies. The combined result of those two things would enable the council to lower the tax increase. Recall, under my proposed budget, we had a tax increase of 3.25%, and that was driven in part due to our use of fund balance in the current year. Under this proposal, you would be able to reduce the tax increase to 1.75%. So looking at the top left-hand side of the slide, the recommended budget adjustments in order to make this happen. First of all, we would bring in some additional state aid based on recent discussions at the General Assembly, another $365,000 in additional ECS, Education Cost Sharing Grant, and then a very nominal number for additional payment in lieu of taxes at $310. So that would be roughly an additional $365,000, $366,000 that we would bring in as state aid for next year. And we think we can rely on this based on conversations with CCM and others who are following what's going on at the Capitol. Secondly, in terms of additional revenues here, we would work to replenish, or we would propose to replenish revenue losses from the pandemic, related to pandemic, and bring in $2,225,000 in rescue plan monies. And then we would transfer in an additional $1,350,000 in unallocated funds from the capital non-recurring expenditure fund budget. And that would result in revenue changes of approximately $3.9 million. $3.9 million. Moving to the expenditure side, on the lower right-hand side of the page, you see the reduction for the school district budget as already reflected in the Board of Education's adopted budget, and that would be a reduction of approximately $748,000. I'm going to discuss the position changes over the next few slides, but I wanted to highlight that Board of Ed reduction, as well as reducing the general fund contribution, that $485,000 to CNRE, which I'll discuss in more detail later on. So let's talk about the proposed budget adjustments in more detail and how we could utilize rescue plan monies in a limited fashion for these purposes. First, we are recommending that the council restore funding for 2 full-time positions. Recall, under my proposed budget, we had left 13 positions vacant. If we were to restore funding for 2, 11 positions would remain unfunded. The first would be to add back a civil engineer 2, and this is the cost of the salary plus FICA and Medicare that would be associated with the position, and this is our estimate. This position is, we think, very, very important. It's responsible for project management duties, especially street reconstruction, stormwater projects, and we anticipate some number of additional projects related to the use of rescue plan monies. And recall, our town engineer, Dwayne Martin, is currently serving as our interim director of community development, doing a fabulous job in that regard. However, he does not have quite as much time for project management as he had in the past, which is another reason why we would recommend restoring this position. There would be an offset here, as you would see. We would eliminate the $50,000 in temporary payroll. This would be to fund a part-time engineer. We would no longer need that part-time position if you were to approve the restoration of the full-time position. Similarly, we are recommending that we restore, or that you fund a unfunded property appraiser 3 position. And this position is responsible for a whole variety of duties. It's a senior level position in the assessor's office. This position reports immediately to the assessor, and there are two of them in the office. One of the positions is unfunded under the proposed budget. They provide a whole variety of duties, including statistical analysis, assisting with conducting hearings, and other duties related to revaluation. And recall, we're in a reval year. There would be an offset as part of this proposal. We are recommending that the council that we would reduce a full-time staff assistant position in that office. It is soon to become vacant. We would reduce it from full-time to part-time. So that would provide a partial offset here of approximately $28,000. So we're requesting or recommending that council restore funding for these two important positions. Next item would be to restore funding for seasonal labor in public works to perform parks maintenance and related duties. And council may recall, we cut this line item last year when we were making the changes when we were making various changes to accommodate the impact to our operations related to the pandemic. Now we have experienced a number of complaints over the past year related to parks maintenance. During the pandemic, there was an uptick in increased usage of our parks, which we think is very positive in many ways. We're expecting that to increase in the coming year. So we would like to have this funding source available so that we could restore the seasonal labor we had in years past to focus on parks maintenance. This would include mowing, removal of the trash, any number of things. Moving on. Next, we are recommending that the council add 3 full-time positions. Add 3 full-time positions, and here they are. First would be a new diversity and inclusion officer, or diversity and equity officer. And we are recommending this in order to help coordinate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across the entire organization, whether it's working with human resources, working with social services, planning and development, public health, public safety. This position would arguably be involved, would be working with colleagues from across the entire organization. They would collaborate with the West Hartford Public Schools and other organizations in our community. These positions, this is an emerging need. I know it's an important policy goal for the council, for our management and leadership team as well. The people who hold this skill set really are at a premium today, and more local governments across the country, communities our size and even smaller, are establishing these positions, given the importance, the significance of this work today. Next, we are proposing that the council create a full-time legal assistant position, and we're recommending this. This person would be responsible for performing paraprofessional duties that are currently handled by our full-time attorneys. And really, that's not the best use of our attorneys' time. In addition, this position would be responsible for providing staff support to our recently reconstituted Fair Rent Commission. Fair Rent Commission has been somewhat dormant in recent years. We have needed to reestablish it in order to help hear any number of fair rent issues that have come in over the past year. And this used to be a full-time position. It was a full-time position for many years until fiscal year 2018. There would also be an offset here. If this is something the council were to approve, we would be able to eliminate temporary payroll at $29,000. And then the last position on this list would be to create an additional public safety dispatcher position. And this is something we need to do regardless. I was planning to bring this to you at this point in the process. This position is necessary in order to help us perform the emergency medical dispatch, or EMD, that dispatch that our emergency response center began to provide over the past year. And it's also included as part of the minimum staffing under our recent contract settlement with CSEA. And then also, in terms of budget adjustments, we are recommending that the council increase the fire department's overtime line by $500,000, by $500,000. We're not proposing that we appropriate funding at this point in time to fill the vacant positions that we've carried in the fire department budget, and that is because we generally always have a hiring lag. But council will recall from previous years, we've been discussing this issue, and how in terms of the adopted budget and what we actually spend on overtime far exceeds what we have budgeted for that purpose. And in most years, that has to do with the fact that we've had some amount of turnover, and we have to train new people. During the past year, FY21 is a little bit of an anomaly because we had to respond to the pandemic and certainly relied on overtime in part for that purpose. But if you look back over the past several years, even as far back as FY14, you can see how actual expenditures are significantly higher than the adopted budget figure. So we think that this would be a more prudent use of these monies, so that we could increase this line in order to be able to better absorb these costs. We still have a fair amount of turnover in the fire department. We still have a generation that is retiring. We've got a number of vacancies and an ongoing recruitment effort. And when we hire somebody new, they need some amount of training, and we have to backfill them on overtime. So those last several slides all relate to our recommended budget adjustments. This slide is a summary of what the amended budget would look like, both revenues and expenditures, if you were to adopt these proposals. And you may recall, under my proposed budget, the increase was 2.79%. This would be a slight decrease to 2.77%. So now talking about the capital non-recurring expenditure fund, CNRE, for a few minutes. What we are recommending here, first of all, we're focused on the operating budget in the interest of time. We understand the council, you need to adopt an operating budget for next fiscal year. And we think we're going to have more time to look at capital needs utilizing rescue plan monies in a more comprehensive way. So what we are recommending or requesting in terms of a CNRE budget for budget adoption purposes is very, very limited. And that would be just $1.2 million to fund body cameras for the police. Council will recall under my proposed budget, we had $400,000 budgeted in the first 3 years of the plan for this project. We're recommending that you fund the full amount up front because that will increase our chances. It will increase the likelihood of us receiving a state grant that would offset approximately 30% of the project. We did have some monies in here for school projects as well, and we found out today that they are going to be utilizing a portion of their rescue plan monies. Recall, they're receiving $10 million. They will use a portion of that funding source for those projects, and they will run it through their general fund budget as opposed to through capital. So looking at the use of rescue plan grant funds, and we are expecting to receive on the town side a little bit more than what we had contemplated, a little over $25 million here. If you were to endorse this proposal, we would use approximately $1.5 million for fiscal year '21, and then another $3.4 million in next fiscal year. That would total a little under $5 million, and we would have a remaining balance of approximately $20 million in those monies. So let me just move on to talk a little bit about the use of rescue plan monies, and then I can pause for questions and your discussion. I'm sorry. Before we get there, let's talk about the tax impact here, the result of these changes. Recall I said the tax increase would fall from 3.25% to 1.75%. And this is the impact on the average home. We do this exercise each and every year. Here in West Hartford, the average single-family home is assessed at 70% at approximately $228,000. This hypothetical homeowner also has 2 vehicles assessed at approximately $10,800. So you can see what the tax bill would look like. In this scenario, the tax bill would increase by $182 for the year. You know, we understand this is just a hypothetical example, and there are some number of taxpayers paying something similar. There are many who are paying a lot more and some who are paying less. This is just a representative example. Now onto the use of the rescue plan funds, and this is for your consideration. So what's allowed under the law for local government, for the pool of money that we received? Number one, local governments can utilize it to support their public health response and for government operations, you know, our response to COVID-19, to the pandemic. Number two, local governments can use it to restore lost revenue, and to replace lost revenue. Third, and this is a relatively large category, local governments can use it to address the negative economic impacts associated with the pandemic, impacts to individual workers and individual families, to businesses and the public sector more generally, the nonprofit sector as well. We can also utilize the monies for a more narrow set of infrastructure that was specifically called out: water, wastewater, stormwater, and broadband infrastructure. And then lastly, premium pay for essential workers, which we don't think is applicable in our case. That would be more for people in the private sector. So those are the allowable uses under the law. So in bringing it here to West Hartford, you know, what I would recommend to you after some discussion with the mayor and others is that you would utilize a portion of the funding to reimburse the town for lost revenue and to restore some key positions, as we presented some minutes ago. But then utilize the bulk of the money, utilize the bulk of it for projects and initiatives that would do various good things that would have lasting value and lasting impact on the community. And here are some number of examples. First, under the category of sustainability and fiscal stability. You know, what are some things we could do now utilizing these monies that would result in future budget savings? You know, could it be a capital project, as an example? Second category would be to help promote your policy goals related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, like the equity officer that we have proposed here. Third category, utilizing the monies to promote economic vitality, including arts and culture, including supporting some of our nonprofit institutions in town, maybe some key infrastructure projects in town center and elsewhere. Another category would be health and human services. What more might we need to do to expand our public health capacity when looking at human services, looking at our social services department? Are there key investments we could make in the Hillcrest area neighborhood outreach center, There are a whole host of examples that come to mind. Next category would be public safety. What strategic investments could we make in public safety that might enable the council, might enable us to lower our operating costs in the future? Technology, another important example. We know how relevant that is to our work day in and day out. What additional applications might we want to bring to town government in order to make our operations run more efficiently and effectively? And last but certainly not least, the quality of life category. Are there key investments you would want to make in our parks, in our play areas, in our public spaces that would help improve quality of life for our residents? In terms of process, what we would suggest here is that you could reconvene the two recovery committees that you created last year, or you could meet as a committee of the whole, whatever you prefer. But use those committees to solicit input, to solicit public input from, you could solicit input from staff. We'll be meeting as a staff. We're going to give you some recommendations. But those committees can also engage with the larger community. You can do that through any number of means. You could do that through a community survey. You could do that through town hall meetings. And then the town council would always need to, the town council as a whole would always need to approve the allocations. And we have through the end of calendar year 2024 to program the use of the monies. They don't all need to be spent by that date, but they should be allocated and programmed by that date. So I'll pause there, Mayor. I'm happy to take questions council members may have, and I know you're going to want to engage in your own discussion as well.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. I have a quick question on slide. If you could go back to, I think it was your third slide, I'm not sure, where you detailed the new positions. Yeah, right there. You didn't touch on the second, you had this, well, I think I didn't hear, maybe I don't know. The 747 Board of Ed, and then the 78, I don't know if we
Oh, I'm
really
sorry,
talked
Mayor.
about that. That's okay.
Yep. I apologize. So that would be an additional full-time position to establish an additional full-time social worker who would be responsible for working very closely with the police department, with the fire department, and others to address key issues that we're dealing with now, such as the panhandling, potentially homelessness. This would be someone that would have that skill set, that would be able to, that would have experience and be able to work closely with that population and work closely with our public safety personnel in collaboration with them. And there are various ways we could fund that. We had been talking, and I want to commend and recognize Chief Riddick and Helen Rubino Turco. They had been working on a partnership to fund this, utilizing monies from the police department budget, at least for a couple of years to get it up and running.
Thank you. All right. I think those are all the numerical, but I would frame part of this as we are very much in a very strategic and I think a time when we are being looked at very, very closely because of we are about to potentially issue a significant bond issue, probably the biggest, maybe the biggest in West Hartford's history to the pension obligation bonds. And the rating agencies are very, very looking at the way our community will spend rescue money and what structurally we are going to do to our budget if we and how we use that money. So I think it's really important to look at that and make sure that all the positions that all the changes and adjustments that we're looking at, the use of revenue, it is really important to take that into consideration. And then the other thing I would talk about is, in that same vein, is what do we do to our budget a year, 2, 3 years down the road? And that's always been, oftentimes, it would have been very easy to take shortcuts and do things in the current year that would have hurt future budgets. But that's not how we have earned our AAA bond rating and kept it. So I would just make sure that that is also something that goes into everybody's considerations of any items they want to discuss. Thank you. All right, Mr. Winograd.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through the screen, it's like 3D. Matt, going through the slides, I'm still trying to add up the numbers, and it's a little hard because I'm trying to look at the old book
Yeah.
to see the differences. It looks like, so the expenditures really haven't changed much, right? Like $50,000, insignificant in terms of the total money, right? I mean,
Correct.
you noted that. So I see on this chart an extra a difference in $4 million in general fund revenue changes
Correct.
that's coming from other than taxes.
Yes.
But a mill is about $6.5 million.
It's closer to 6.2.
Okay, 6.2 million. And by doing this, we're dropping the mill rate from over 3 to 1.75. So we're dropping it more than a mill. And I don't see $8 million in extra revenue. I'm trying to figure out where I see some of it, but I'm not.
So in order to decrease in order to bring down the tax increase by 1%, you need to reduce the budget by approximately 2.7 million. It's not the same as the value of a mill.
Right. So the original mill rate that we had proposed, you had proposed what for a mill rate? That's
Yeah. Mr. Privatera is going to supplement my comments.
Thank you.
Hi, Pete Privatera, Finance Director. We're reducing the mill rate by 0.73 mils, I believe.
Okay.
What you're looking at is a tax increase from 3.25 to 175, but the mill rate is actually going down by 3/4 of a mil.
That makes sense. I was looking for the mill rate, and I hadn't been able to find
Right,
that
right.
comparison. So
Right. The original mill rate was, well, what we're proposing right now, which is,
41.8.
right,
Oh, I see,
2.5.
42.3. Okay, that,
Yeah,
there it is.
42.5.
42.53. So it was 43.3, somewhere around that. I don't have it in
Right.
front of me. So reducing the mill rate by, I believe, was 0.73 mils, almost 3/4 of a mil.
Okay,
And it's all primarily through non-tax revenue.
and that's coming in primarily from
Correct.
the ARR grant.
And we are, one of the things that we're doing, and the mayor made a good point about, we have a credit rating coming up, not presentation, but discussion with the rating agencies. So if you recall, we had put 1.5 million in CNRE unallocated fund balance, which we were going to use to transfer back so we can maintain our fund balance ratio. But since we're going to be using some other funds, we're going to transfer in that 1.3 million from CNRE to the general fund. Okay, so we're transferring that money into the general fund.
Yep.
And we're transferring the ARRA grant money into the general fund. And that's how we're going to get to the 3.9 million.
And is there any impact on this budget from the fact that we're now replenishing the reserve fund with the 1.5 million?
Well, see,
as well?
I
Does
guess
that do anything?
I guess the point is, we're not going to need to use our fund balance. We're not going to need to dip into our fund balance because we're substituting it with the ARRA money.
Okay, but that was for 21, right? We were planning on
At the
using
end
it?
of this fiscal year, correct.
Okay.
Correct. So,
We never did it. We just
well,
we
if
budgeted it just in case.
this is, if you look at the slide that has fiscal year 21, you can see a $1,350,000 transfer into the general fund. That's going to be used to basically not, that's going to prevent us from going into our fund balance. That $1,350,000, we're going to use to balance the budget, so we won't need to go into fund balance. And that probably, I have a footnote there, that probably will be less than that because we're going to wait to the end of the fiscal year because our fiscal year numbers are looking a lot better than they did a couple months ago. So we may only need to transfer in $1.1 or $1.2 million to balance out this year's budget, so we will not need to use fund balance.
And we're not going to get an additional surplus that we'd often have to then put that money in the fund.
No,
balance as
because
well. We won't be doing that this year.
whatever surplus is left over, let's say we have $400,000 of surplus this year. We're going to take that surplus and we're going to transfer in whatever we need to balance the budget, $1 million, $1 million, and we're not going to have any surplus this year.
Okay.
We're not going to have to go into fund balance.
Thank you, Mr. Winograd. Okay. Mr. Sweeney. It's really hard to, like, you were right, I'm like, I see raising his hand, and the sun's coming right through. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for this, Mr. Hart. Appreciate the going. This is not an easy task in this time. So just a couple of quick questions. Some of the salary bases here that one that just seemed glaring to me was the legal assistant starting at 70 grand as a former paralegal. That seems like a exceptionally high number to start a paralegal off at, particularly if it's going to be starting into. So I wanted to note that seems very high for a paralegal. I also just have a question about if we're going to use in your guideline for the federal dollars was to deal with some of the new staff or new needed staff. Why wouldn't you budget the American Rescue Fund into using some of the new additions that you have in this budget? So I guess the question is, with the new additions that you have in regards to staff, why wouldn't we use ARA funding on that, since a lot of them are based around public safety? I understand the concept is that you're actually supposed to not use any of it for long-term staffing positions. But why is it in some cases that we are, in some cases that we're not, is the question I have.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney. Mr. Privatera, Mr. Hart, I think Mr.
I can answer the question on a legal assistant. We consider that a fully loaded position. That has Social Security, it has 401A and 457 contribution. So it's probably going to be, $8,000, $9,000 less than that as a starting salary.
Okay.
And with respect to the ARA money, and I'll give you my comment, we're taking it as a general fund revenue. All right, so we're taking it as a general fund revenue, and we're not targeting any one specific position or any one specific expenditure. The interim guidelines basically say that we can use this money to replenish our revenue up to a certain level. So that's what we're doing in 21 and in 22. We're just taking it in a similar manner that we would take in any other federal grant to offset an expenditure. The only reason why we're splitting it up between the ARA grant money and the transferring from CNRE is because this way there'll be more ARA grant money left over to do any other community programs that you wanted to do. So we're not targeting it to any specific position.
Okay. I just see there's a lot of relation between some of these new positions that we're adding here and some of them that are coming out due to COVID. I mean, notably the one the mayor mentioned in regards to the social worker. So just something that I would think about. And then lastly, based on this as well, why wouldn't we use ARA funding for the fire overtime money? That seems like an exact use for this money.
Again, what we're recommending is that we would bring in that revenue to support the general fund budget overall, as opposed to earmarking it for specific positions. We could look at that approach, but we thought this made more sense.
Well, I mean, it's $500,000 that I think that is, when, at least my understanding, for the American Rescue Plan, that overtime, anything incurred due to COVID or any kind of additional public safety expense that we're having, that's what that funding is for. And I would imagine that a lot of the fire, to your point about a lot of this is due to the new structure that we have over there, is based on the new format over there. That seems like something that we might want to consider as a potential space to use that money on while we have it. Particularly since we're kind of both starting our EMS program kind of at the same timeline that COVID started as well. So I don't know if we have a real true idea of the cost of that program yet from our side, because they kind of started at about the same time, maybe a year or two off from each other. But it just seems like a really good potential use of that money to save the town in regards to the costs that incurred by the EMS program. So, just a thought. But thank you, Madam Mayor. I appreciate it, and really appreciate the time that you guys put into this. I know, as Mr. Wintergrad noted, a lot has changed since we last saw us, and really do appreciate that. And the comments are just in trying to also understand how to use this federal money too. So I appreciate the time.
Nate, Mr. Hart.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. We could look at Mr. Sweeney's suggestion with respect to how we would fund the fire department overtime. Again, we're bringing in some amount of that revenue to support the general fund overall, which would include that expense. We could look at utilizing additional Rescue Act monies, but you have to be careful that we have to be mindful that we don't want to incur or create a structural deficit that we would need to address in either fiscal year 23, fiscal year 24, maybe even as late as fiscal year 25. So that's an issue we're trying to keep an eye on as well.
Mr. Williams, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. To follow up on that, I just have a couple questions for you, Matt. So I hear what you're saying about we don't want to create budget, shortfalls in the out years by maybe overusing the ARA funds. Like if we threw all 25 million this year, then there was a tax relief as a result. Then next year there would have to be an increase. But what I just want to understand is with the credit rating, is there also a strategic reason for using a fraction of it, 5 out of the 25 million now? Is that, because it seems like that's a consideration. I just don't understand that point. So if that is a consideration, just want to understand.
I can answer
Yeah.
that. One of the concerns that we have is when we go to the credit rating agencies, they're going to want to know, okay, if you're using a part of this Rescue Act money, what's going to happen 2 years from now? What's going to happen 3 years from now? One of the reasons why we're keeping it low is because when we issue pension obligation bonds, we're fortunate enough we're able to reduce the amount of debt we're going to be issuing to about $324 million because our pension fund did very well last year. So because of that, my expectation is we're going to probably have around a $2 to $2.5 million reduction in debt service in fiscal year 23. So this is for fiscal year 22. When fiscal year 23 comes around, if we don't plan on using any additional American Rescue Act money, that debt service savings will offset this infusion of cash that we won't have again. So my concern is to try to keep everything in balance for the next 2 to 3 years. So when the credit rating agencies ask, well, what are you going to do 2 years from now when you have a $2 or $3 million hole in your budget? My answer is, well, we have a plan for that with a reduction in debt service.
Okay. And then, thanks for that response. On an unrelated note, did the MDC get ARA funds, and if so, is that going to impact our budgeting moving forward or this year? Do you know?
That's a good question. I actually asked Senator Blumenthal that in one of our webinars, and they were checking, but I don't think they directly received money. I think they might be able to. I don't know if they're going to qualify for the county distribution at all, because it's all based on population. So that's that's an important question for us to pursue. We can, as taxpayers, to support projects that the MDC is working on. But they're having a direct, but Matt, do you have any more information?
Now, my understanding is the same as yours, Mayor. I don't believe they received any money out of this funding source, but arguably, and this is one of the things we're discussing with the MDC, is could they look at funding some of their projects through some of the other categories of rescue plan funding.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Galt?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, gentlemen, for the presentation. Really appreciate it. And pivoting as quickly through this as it's very fluid. I do have, I guess, a couple quick questions or comments. The positions that we're adding, are those the actual costs, total costs, or are we talking about salary in those positions that we're talking about, the 3 full-times and such? Relative to those 3 positions, then, in terms of the diversity and inclusion officer, is there somebody currently doing this in-house? Has somebody or anybody here assumed that position or done anything along those lines to accommodate that need? And maybe if you can talk to me a little bit about the legal assistant, as Mr. Sweeney brought up. Can you maybe define that individual's role as it relates to the Fair Housing, Fair Rent Commission? And then lastly, has there been any thought in terms of the public safety dispatcher as to whether or not that can be a position that might be partnered with another community, another town, to share in those costs going forward, if that's possible?
Mr. Hart?
All right, I can respond to those, and Peter can supplement as necessary, and hopefully I'll remember them all, Councilor Gold. So, first of all, with respect to the salary numbers, those include an estimated salary somewhere within the range, as well as some of the fringe, Medicare, FICA, and whether or not they're entitled to a 457 or 401 contribution. Does not include a contribution to the pension or to health insurance, because those funds are currently funded at a capacity where they could absorb the addition of a handful of positions like this. So it includes salary and a portion of the fringe. With respect to your questions regarding the diversity officer, the equity officer, we do not have someone dedicated to that role right now. We have been doing some of that work in human resources. Actually, our leadership, we have a leadership development initiative underway right now, utilizing an outside contractor, someone who is skilled in the professional development side. But that is really focused on the human resources component here. What we're talking about is someone who would be able to support us looking at the very broad scale of what we do. Not just human resources, as important as that is, but also someone who could interface with the school district, with cultural organizations, work with various segments of our population. So we've been just doing limited work in this regard. Our school district is some years ahead of us in its work, and actually that's pretty common in Connecticut. School districts have been involved in this work for the last 5, maybe 8 years at the outset, and municipal governments are getting into it more recently. And then your question related to the dispatcher, could we share that position? I think only if we were to have a shared dispatch center, which we don't have now. It is something the chief and I talk about potentially for the future, but what we have right now is an emergency response center that's part of our police department. It also supports our fire department. And when we took on the provision of emergency medical dispatch, which we were required to do pursuant to state law, we determined that we needed an additional person in order to make that happen. And then you also asked about the duties for the legal assistant. It would be more or less a paralegal, and we will take a critical look at the salary to see if it should be adjusted. We took the range that was in effect when we last had someone full-time in that role. Did I miss anything, Keith?
No, that's it exactly.
Mr. Go, you have,
Oh, thank you very much. You hit all the points.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hart.
Can I just
Uh,
follow
Mr.
up on
Sweeney.
Mr. Gold? So on Mr. Gold's point, as on the diversity inclusion officer, I see that you do say public safety, so that means that this person would be interfacing with both fire and police. Is that right?
This person would report directly to me, would be part of the town manager's office, but would interact with all of our departments, including public safety.
Would be doing trainings with our public safety. Is that right?
Yep, public safety and other departments as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney. On the phone, are there questions and comment, or
I have a question.
Mrs. Kerrigan, go ahead.
To you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for the presentation.
I am concerned about this diversity and inclusion officer for $100,000 plus, and I do appreciate Councilor Gold's question, because I had the same one. We say $100,000, but then when you throw in health benefits and all the other bennies that come along, what are we really spending for this individual? So that's one factor. But the other thing for me is, can you explain to me specifically what this individual will be doing? What does a typical day or week look for what this individual will be doing? Because it was my understanding, at least when it comes to hiring, so that at least our town employees are diverse, that both, Chief Reddick and Tom Moore, as well as you, Matt Hart, are sensitive to diversity and inclusion. So, and I'm kind of curious how this came to be. What is the history behind that? And then I'm going to leave with one last question: was, when you look at full-time and part-time staff in our town, can you get a comparison with similar towns throughout Connecticut, how many full-time / part-time employees they have compared to what we have? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kerrigan.
Raising his hand, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Councilor Kerrigan, for your good questions. So the diversity officer position, we do not have a set job description for it yet. We are developing one. We've looked at those that other communities have in place. Human resources certainly would be part of the work, but this would not be a dedicated human resources position. Again, the person would report directly to me. And I think their duties would consist of a whole variety of professional tasks, such as program and policy development across a broad spectrum, across the entire portfolio of our operations, and helping us to bring that diversity lens to our day-to-day work. When we're designing programs and services, when we're designing the budget, when we're looking at issues such as affordable housing, when we're looking at issues such as panhandling, and when we're providing training to our staff with respect to hiring and promoting people. So again, I think it would be a pretty broad scope of responsibilities. Yes, many of us are doing bits and pieces of that each and every day right now, but there's no one that's really dedicated to the effort in a comprehensive and holistic way. Someone who is devoting time and energy to researching all the best practices associated with that work either. Excuse me. So that's what we're looking to bring here into focus. In terms of your questions regarding comparable staffing, we can get that to some extent. looking at full-service communities in the state that are roughly our size. I know when we've conducted those studies in the past, our numbers were very competitive in terms of, we either had a similar number or a lower number across many departments. We can look at that data to the extent that it's readily available through CCM. However, in order to conduct a very comprehensive review on that question, we wouldn't have time to do that before next week.
Anything further, Ms. Kerrigan?
Yeah, so,
You can provide us with some basic comparisons before next week?
Thank you, Ms. Kerrigan. Ms. Hart?
Yep, we'll do our best.
okay, and not to, it sounds.
Out of me, this diversity and inclusion officer, everyone loves those words. I know the police department works really hard at diversity. I guess I'm confused. This individual, you spoke about, they're going to design programs and policy development. What does that mean?
Thank you, Ms. Kerrigan. Mr. Hart?
Could mean a variety of things, and it could be, again, training professional development programs for town staff. That could be one assignment. It could be working with our new advisory group on affordable housing. It could be working on fair rent issues, any number of things. It could be looking at working with social services with respect to the programs and services we provide in that department at Hannock and elsewhere. Be interfacing with the nonprofit community and building relationships there, building partnerships there. And any number of those activities. And I get your point, Counselor, about, we don't want it to just be a feel-good effort. These positions fail, and the mayor and I were talking about this recently. Some organizations approach this as checking off a box. Okay, we established this position, we did this training, we're good. We're good for another 3 years, whatever it is. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about approaching this in a more comprehensive and holistic way, making it real and relevant to all of our programs and services. And realizing that is going to require a sustained effort. What I talk about with employees when we're talking about this topic, and we've spent a lot of time on it over the past year, is how do we make equity and inclusion part of our organizational DNA? How do we make it one of our core organizational values? And that requires work and a sustained effort. It's not something you do in a 6-hour training block and check off the box and you're done.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Ms. Kerrigan?
Yeah,
Thank you. I don't, my own biased opinion is hiring someone for $100,000 is not going to solve the problem of diversity and inclusion. I'm curious, what's the qualifications for this $100,000 job, which doesn't include benefits and health care?
Thank you, Ms. Kerrigan. Mr. Hart?
Thank you, Councilor Kerrigan. Again, I wouldn't see as creating this position alone as solving the problem, to use those words. Again, I think this position would help organize and coordinate our efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion into the future. In terms of qualifications, typically you would require a bachelor's, maybe a master's degree in a related field. Ideally, I would say 2 to 5 years experience directly in this field or in a similar discipline.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Ms. Kerrigan?
no other questions.
Okay.
I have a question.
All right, Ms. Blank.
Through you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Hart, for your presentation. And Mr. Privatera, most of my questions were already asked, so I don't want to belabor it. But I do want to stick with the three additional positions that you're adding. And one, I do want to start with the diversity and inclusion officer. So Matt, my question to you is, have you looked at this position in terms of how it's used in either other states, towns, or cities, similar to our size?
Thank you, Ms. Blanks. Mr. Hart?
Thank you, Councilor Blanks, for your question. Yes, I have looked at it to a certain extent. One position that I'm really intrigued by is a new position in the town of Lexington, Massachusetts. One of my colleagues is the town manager there. They're doing some work that is very similar to what we've embarked upon here in West Hartford. That is just one position we've looked at, and our human resources department has started to collect comparables as well. And once I have more of that information, I'm happy to provide it to the town council through the Finance and Administration Committee that Human Resources reports to.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Ms. Blanks?
Yes, thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. And then my other question, similar to the other counselors who've gone before me, with this number of 252, I'm wondering if there's a range in terms of this position. So with the 252, where are we? Are we in the middle? Is this the beginning? I don't think it's the top. So can you elaborate on that for me a little bit?
Thank you, Ms. Blanks.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Councilor Blanks. So the salary range for this position, what we are earmarking right now, and we will refine it, is that it would be set at the assistant to the town manager pay scale. We have not had someone in that role for many, many years, but we thought that would provide us with a rough comparable. That range is roughly, I would say, 90 to maybe 90 to 110,000. So what you have here in front of you at the $100,000 mark, the salary is about $90,000. Peter told me, and then $10,000 for a portion of the fringe benefits.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Ms. Blanks?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And one final question, which is around the legal assistant, similar type of question in terms of the salary at 75. I heard Councilor Sweeney ask if that's on the high side. So I'm just curious in terms of the range of that salary, if that's in the middle, if it's at the beginning, and in terms of the duties of what this position would be doing. And as that person advances, where's the cap? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Blanks. Mr. Hart?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Councilor Blanks. I don't know the range for that position off the top of my head. I would assume the salary is that we used for the budget estimate is closer to $60,000, and then you've got some amount for fringe. Peter, do you know the range, Mr. Privatera?
That position caps at 65,000. What you see in front of you with the 70,000 includes FICA, it includes 401 and 457. So we just mirrored what the salary was for the previous incumbent. Obviously, once someone is hired, there's going to be some flexibility on reducing that.
Ms. Blanks, I'm not sure you heard that. Did you hear that? 60.
Mr. Privatera faded
Towards the end. So would you just repeat that, please?
Sure. I'm sorry. That position caps 5,000. What the number you have before you, the 70,000, includes Social Security, includes the Medicaid portion of Social Security, FICA. It also includes a 457 and a 401A contribution. We left the salary at the previous incumbent's salary, which was towards the top of the range. But obviously, there's a lot of flexibility when hiring someone to bring someone in at mid to low to mid of the range as well. But we just use the same salary.
Thank you, Mr. Privatera. Mr. Hart is raising his hand. Hold on, Ms. Blanks. Ms. Hart? Ms. Hart?
And just to respond to Counselor Blank's questions on the duties, again, this is more or less a paralegal position, handling those responsibilities. Presently, right now, our full-time attorneys, Deputy Corporation Counselor Verano in particular, she unfortunately has to spend a lot of time searching land records, doing filings, all sorts of things that arguably should be performed by a different position. She's utilizing too much of her time for those types of tasks, and it is not the most effective use of her time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hart. Ms. Blanks, anything further?
Thank you, Mayor. No further questions.
I just have a follow-up.
Is this split in between Board of Ed and council in any way because they support the Board of Education, or no?
We hadn't contemplated that, Mayor, but we could explore it.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Sweeney.
I just wanted to know, I was looking around as we were talking about this diversity and inclusion officer. It seems to be, as you said, Mr. Hart, a really big growing trend within municipalities. Something that I'm glad that you are putting in here. I think it's also something to be noted. This is like one of the biggest growing spaces in the corporate world right now. Most every company has one, if not is looking at it. Almost, I think most cities in Connecticut are moving in that direction, and the range for this in the private and public sector, from what like my back of the napkin Google research was, anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000. So, it looks like most people who are qualified for it have significant amount of graduate level experience, and I think the town would be well served by a similar position. But I know that people are throwing a lot of stuff out there, and I just wanted to, we had some time to throw that out there as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney. Ms. Fay, I haven't heard from you. I didn't know if you had any. Oh, well, first, I think we're all set with Ms. Blanks. I think she said she's fine. Ms. Fay, do you have any comments, questions?
I've been following the conversation, and I think it's great to ask the more detailed questions about the salaries, but they pale in comparison to other moving parts of the budget. So even if you eliminated both, you're only talking about $175,000. So I don't mean only, every penny counts. That's not what I mean. But, we do big transactions, the pension obligation bonds that had a big financial impact. And I just think we should focus on the bigger things, the bigger items, and see if there's any latitude there. But thank you very much.
Okay. Mr. Davidoff.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Don't have any questions, but I do have some commentary. So with respect to the new positions being presented, it would seem that the manager, in discussion with his directors, determined that these positions at this time are needed and necessary to perform duties and responsibilities for the efficient running of the government, and the changes in some of the positions with respect to the property appraiser, civil engineer, and to restore the seasonal labor force reflect the realities of what's occurring on a day-to-day basis here in Town Hall. So I think for my colleagues, it's for us to determine whether or not these requests of the manager and the professional staff seem reasonable and are timely with respect to the budget going forward. Additionally, the funds or the amount of funds that we plan on using from the American Rescue Plan is a decision I think that each of us need to determine as to whether or not they are sufficient, excessive, not enough, and understand the consequences of allocating either too much in a particular year, as Mr. Privatera pointed out, so as not to create a gap in future years. And as the mayor rightly noted earlier, we've been very cognizant over the years to make certain that we don't create one-time uses which would require a substantial increase in tax liability in future years. And then the last thing I want to just comment on is on the diversity officer. Mr. Sweeney was correct in his back of the napkin analysis, because I did look at that last evening, and it demonstrated that the salary that's being proposed is very competitive with that in the private sector. And not only do you see it in the private sector, you see it a lot in educational institutions of higher learning as well. And so I dug a little bit further, and not every single person would be qualified to serve as a diversity, inclusion, equity officer. I think the standard would be somebody who had certification in this field. And that seems to be the standard with respect to candidates who are serving in these roles, whether it be in the private or public or educational institutional settings. So I understand that this particular position is something that has come out of the last year and a half of what's been happening in the country. So I think that for us to turn a deaf ear to it, or to be blind to what's really occurring, would not keep West Hartford ahead of the curve. So I do support the creation of this position. With respect to the conversation about the overtime, the 500,000, which seems that we're putting in this budget, is a very interesting point that was raised, I believe, by both Mr. Sweeney and Mr. Williams, with respect to we haven't done in the past. The manager has pointed out that's always a struggle throughout the year. When we look at the month-to-month performance of the budget, we always notice that the fire department overtime is something that always is one of the bigger numbers driving either a deficit in our budget. So it's not something that we should be surprised about. It's something that we've seen quite often. So it's really a question for us sitting around the table as policymakers to determine whether we want to accept the reality of the situation, that it's inherent in the way that we're funding the positions in the fire department and meeting the obligations that are presented there, or we just continue down the path that we have for at least the last decade of not including it in the budget. All of these things that we're discussing this evening, just sitting back and listening to them, basically, in my opinion, come down to whether or not you buy into the points raised by the manager and the finance director and the professional staff who work for us with respect to, are they necessary, are they cost effective, will they create better efficiencies, and will it keep us a leading community? So that's not something I would expect anyone to come to a conclusion this evening, but I do think that if we're going to adopt a budget next week, those are things that really need to go into people's understanding as to whether or not they support the budget that the council is going to present and adopt next Tuesday, the 25th. So I think there could be more discussion amongst us with respect to that. If people want to discuss the merits of these concepts, I think those, in my opinion, are the broader concepts. And that's all I want to say, Madam Mayor. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that. I think we, having seen this, really need to first reflect as to, is this in the best interest of our community, and is this fiscally responsible moving forward, knowing all the various pieces with respect to debt service, taxpayers' ability to pay, and have we done our due diligence to arrive at a budget that accurately reflects the needs of our community in the upcoming fiscal year.
Thank you, Mr. Davidoff. But there was not a question in there, right?
Just comments.
Okay. All right. So just a couple more comments. remember from 2019, the adopted budget that we had for 2019 to 2020, we did not have any budget adjustments. There was no decrease or increase to our budget. We had contractual obligations. We did lay off a number of part-time people because we were not offering services, but some of the structural budget drivers, still existed. So we're coming off of a budget that did not we did not cover those, nor are we covering them from fund balance. So it is from savings within that budget year. So again, it was a lean budget, and those structural changes did happen, and so we're coming off. So again, you really have to go back 2 years to really look at the budget impact on that. So I would note that. I also want to note that what Mr. Sweeney said actually on overtime, and that was a really good fit for ARP money, that actually is not what they're necessarily saying. So they were talking about premium pay for workers, but not necessarily overtime pay. We have not received, I think, more clarification on that. So it's a little fuzzy. So there were interesting ways on how that ARPA money could be used, and sort of that revenue shortfall, and it really was going back and saying, what was your revenue and where did you fall short that year before and 2 years before? So that's kind of that is the strategy that we are using, rather than saying there's specific items that we're offsetting, because that's actually specific guidance that we're not supposed to offset specific line items. So it's that bucket shortfall, comparing 1 year to another year with an escalator, and saying, where did you fall short, and those line items. And the other thing I'd like to talk about for a minute is, we all know parking revenues went down. There was some discussion on enterprise funds and whether enterprise funds would be a qualifying reimbursement from ARPA money. And I don't think, we don't have I don't think we have guidance on that yet, specific guidance. So we left out the Parking Enterprise Fund, the Leisure Services Enterprise Fund, and any contributions to that. So, all right. And this is what I would say. The diversity, equity, and inclusion, almost every communication that I get from national, either National League of Cities or Route 50 or other communications that we get, other municipalities are prioritizing, institutionalizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. That doesn't happen by chance. It doesn't happen incidentally. It is intentional and a commitment. Nor does it happen as, oh, we're hiring this person and we're good and we're done. That's not what this is about. This is about a strategy on how to incorporate considerations, respect, and real, I think, attention to the fact that this is something that has been overlooked for so many years and needs to be incorporated at every level of an organization. Also in interactions with the public, and nonprofits, as Matt said, but with the general public as well. This is also in including in recruitment, maybe for commissions, and talking about and pipelines to governance. So it's sort of all of the above. And I don't think, I think this salary actually looks a bit on the lean side from what we've seen. And these positions are hard to come by. The recruitment is intense, and And I think it's an important commitment that we make. I would say that that is coming out of, if I was to say something that was coming out of that ARPA money, I would say that is it, but I would also say that it's built into our structure. Because I think we're going to need that support either from experts on the outside or somebody from the inside, which I think shows a higher level of commitment. But that's my thoughts on that piece. And I actually want to give a thank you to Chief Riddick and to Helen Rubino Turco for creatively thinking about potential resourcing a social worker. We know, actually, for a long, long time, I think our community has been in need of additional social work support, and I think this is a step in that direction. I know we can't do all we want to do, we surely can't, but this is, I think, something that, from the budget perspective as a whole, doesn't impact, it's moving some pieces and joining departments in a resourcing in a way that I think really is creative, and I appreciate it very much. So now, I think Ms. Fay brought up a very, very good point. The big items are the big items, and what's the biggest driver of this budget is our education budget. In addition, then it goes to our police department, and then it goes to our fire department, and then it goes to our public works department. And so those are the things that are going to move the needle. I do think, and I'm very pleased that I look forward to actually finalizing our pension obligation bond sale and seeing what those savings ultimately will be. But those changes are the big items. They're also the things that define our community. And so chipping away at them in a small way isn't going to move the needle very much, but chipping in them in a big way might. But also I think it would fundamentally change our community. So those are things that I think we need to really be honest about and upfront about. But I also think if you have suggestions, please get them to Mr. Hart so he can process them and give you feedback on what any change might mean to the budget. And I think for now I'll ask again if there's any further questions or comments. On the phone? Oh, on the floor?
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. All right. So we have we have a meeting set on Wednesday. I don't know if we need that meeting. I think it's up to feedback we will get. We can cancel it. It's FOI. It's on, and we can make I think a game time decision on whether we get feedback from counselors, and there's some ideas that we need to flesh through. If we don't hear from you, then I think you see the adjustments that we've all seen. It's no longer the town manager's budget, it's now our budget. But if you have any suggestions, please let the town manager, and I would appreciate any information, as well as I'm sure the chair of our finance department, Mr. David F. Wood, as well. So I would urge you to do that, and then we will need I think staff will need some time to come up with the resolutions for Tuesday night. So, right? Correct.
Yes, that'd be very helpful to have that lead time. Thank you, Mayor. We're working on those resolutions now.
Okay. All right. With that, I think, Mr. Sweeney, question? Yes, we have an executive session, but yes. But any other questions on the two items on the agenda, the finance the financial, 2022 financials, and the use of ARPA money? And again, more conversations and discussions will happen with ARPA too, so we will have lots of time to talk about that. Okay? All right. I'm not going to close, but I'm going to make a motion that we go into executive session to discuss, Mr. Hart.
It's a little tricky under freedom of information, but technically it's not an executive session. It's a closed session discussion on collective bargaining. So, Mayor, I would just adjourn the meeting and
Thank you.
ask the counselors to stay.
My corporation counsel left, so I couldn't get good guidance. That's true. That's true. All right, we will make a motion with a
Move to adjourn.
move to adjourn. Is there a second? Second. All. Thank you. Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. We are adjourned, and now we will be in closed session. Phone people on the phone, please stay on the phone.